Have you ever stared at your to-do list knowing exactly what you need to do, but somehow you just can't start? Or maybe you start, but then obsess over every little detail until you feel completely stuck? What if I told you that procrastination and perfectionism aren't opposites, but actually two sides of the same ADHD struggle? In today's episode, we are unpacking the perfectionism procrastination loop, why so many ADHD women entrepreneurs get trapped in it, and most importantly, how to break free. Because let's be real, perfectionism feels productive, but in reality, it's really just fancy procrastination. It keeps you stuck in overthinking, self doubt, and unfinished projects, while your big ideas sit on the shelf collecting dust. And I know you've got way too much brilliance to waste on that cycle. By the end of this episode, you'll know exactly how to stop letting perfectionism kill your progress, rewire your brain to take action before the last minute, and start getting things done without sacrificing quality. Are you ready? Let's dive in. Welcome to the Self-Loved ADHD Woman's Way podcast. I'm your host, Jen Barnes. If you're an ADHD woman entrepreneur, ADHD adjacent, or ADHD-ish, you've come to the right place. We'll dive deep into the unique challenges you face, from the inner turmoil to the outer obstacles. We'll blend neuroscience, IFS, and somatic healing, and explore practical strategies to help you navigate the world of entrepreneurship with ADHD with greater ease and effectiveness. I'm glad you're here. Hey, it's Jen. I'm so glad you're here. I'm really excited to talk about this aspect of procrastination that tends to trip people up. I used to be stuck in it most of my youth and in my 20s and some of my 30s, and it can still trip me up from time to time. So we're going to talk about this procrastination perfectionism loop. And I just want to say, I don't know if you know this, but in a lot of ways, procrastination and perfectionism are like best friends. Because the thing is a lot of times, one way we can stall putting ourselves out there is by trying to make everything perfect. Now, I get it with ADHD. Certainly, we've had our fair share of criticism. You hear me talk about the estimate like 20,000 extra negative, critical, or corrective comments by age 10 than our non ADHD peers. So I'm not saying like that we don't have fears around criticism. In fact, that may be what fuels our perfectionism. But the problem is when we get stuck in perfectionism and this image of what it has to look like or else we can't do it, then a lot of times we don't even start or definitely don't finish. And if this is you, I'm pretty sure you know what I mean. And there's no shame in it. Like I said, we learned this, most of us, because we didn't want to get in trouble. We didn't want people to criticize us, correct us, or whatever. And we were just like, okay, if I perfect everything, then there's no room for anyone to judge me or criticize me. The problem with that, of course, is that people are going to judge and correct and criticize you no matter what you do, just by the fact that you're different from them sometimes. So perfectionism becomes a real barrier to getting stuff done. And this is particularly exacerbated with ADHD because of our past struggles with rejection and criticism. And I just want to say, like, our ADHD brains have this love-hate relationship with high standards and fear of failure because of all of this, right? We, especially if you're one of these ADHD women entrepreneurs who, as a girl like me, masked through over functioning and high achievement, you likely also were like afraid of failing or getting in trouble or whatever else, so that you over functioned to make sure that didn't happen. And so you created these high standards for yourself, sometimes impossibly high standards, so that there was no way you could fail. And that probably worked for you for a while. I know it worked for me for a while. And then once I went bigger than I had before. When I was taking my I don't know how many actuarial exams I was in, but I'd passed 4 and I was finally taking life contingencies. It was so much material, so much content, and so many different moving pieces, all independent study, and it was also very boring, which was not great for the ADHD brain, that I had met my match. There was no room for perfectionism here. I had to figure out, like, how do I do good enough? And at that time, I didn't know how. So I really, really fell apart. So if this is you and you haven't fallen apart at this point, that might happen. Like, it might get to a point where your high standards start to look a lot like anxiety, or you're struggling to get stuff done. You might even get depressed. And so it can be a real problem when we have these high standards. And don't get me wrong, I'm not bad talking high standards, because honestly, some of the perfectionism and high standards is what got me to where I am today. However, it's just no longer productive now and with what you're trying to do now, especially after years and years of doing it. So what does this look like? How might you know that you're stuck in this perfectionism procrastination loop? So you might constantly delay starting tasks because you want the perfect plan, right? If you find yourself over planning, planning to an extreme, then that is probably a fancy kind of procrastination. It looks like you're doing something, but sometimes it's really a way of putting things off. You might find yourself over researching or overthinking things, or never really feeling like you're ready. Oh, I just have to do this first. I'm not quite ready. And if you catch yourself saying that, that might be a sign that you're in this cycle. It doesn't mean you're like a bad person. It's not a moral judgment, but perhaps it is an indicator that you can pause and start to shift into something different, which is what we're going to talk about later in this episode. You might also find yourself abandoning projects halfway or partway through because they're just not good enough. It could be that you abandon projects because you're bored, but it could also be that it's not going the way you think it needs to in order to meet your high standard. And so that could be another sign. It might also be if you find yourself working really well under last minute pressure and not really otherwise, but then you feel burned out. Which obviously, if you've been listening to me for a while, that's an unproductive cycle, because once you actually hit burnout, the only thing you can do to recover from that, the first thing you need to do is have a period of time of complete nothingness. And if it's like overall burnout, sometimes that can be weeks, months, whatever. If it's more just like a cycle of intense hyper focus and crashing, you might just need a day or two. But it's important to understand the risks we take when we get in this cycle of last minute pressure and pushing for perfectionism and then end up burning out. So, ADHD actually makes this cycle worse. Like, our ADHD fuels this cycle. And one of the ways is we have this hyper focus capacity. And it's kind of a double edged sword, because, like, we can do this really, really deep work, but I don't know about you, but sometimes when I'm deep in a hyper focus, I'll eventually catch myself getting really nitty gritty and like super perfectionistic about something. Like, it's got to be just right. The other day, I was messing with my YouTube banner, and the number of times I redid it, it was pretty obnoxious. I was like, okay, now I'm just going for perfect. Thankfully, I caught myself, but not as early as I would have liked. So I ended up probably wasting about a full 30 minutes, maybe even 45, more than I really needed to do. It probably looked fine in the beginning. So there's that, right? So that's one of the ways ADHD can actually make this cycle keep going, or at least something we experience more often than not, right? RSD. Oh, yeah. Good old rejection sensitive dysphoria. So, likely, fear of judgment keeps you from finishing. Because what happens when a project is finished? You put it out there for everyone to see. And when you put something out there, that means you could be judged, you could be rejected. And so it can just even be like a fear of dealing with those big feelings that's keeping you stuck. And that's probably why you're wanting it to be perfect so that you are lessening the chances that you'll get rejected or that you'll receive that negative criticism. But then like it's keeping you stuck, right? But definitely our tendencies towards RSD can fuel this loop that we're talking about today. And the last one we're going to talk about is time blindness. So, a lot of us with ADHD have a hard time conceptualizing time the way the neurotypical brain does. A lot of us don't feel or sense time passing the way that our non ADHD peers do. Some of it can be because we don't actually notice like the shifts of the sun or things happening throughout the day. So, we might not notice we need to go to the bathroom or eat or that our cats haven't been fed, although I have a cat who screams at me. So I don't think I would miss that one. But at any rate, although sometimes she screams, we've had this conversation, Eva and I, that like she screams so much that sometimes we're getting into the boy cries wolf kind of story. So there has been like one occasion where I actually didn't realize I hadn't fed them and it was like 9:30 at night, which is way late because she cries about everything, so I didn't catch that that's what she was crying about. Anyway, back on track. So, time blindness is real, right? And how this can interact with this perfectionism procrastination cycle is we'll think to ourselves, oh, I can always work on perfecting this later. But then you don't put it out there, which is the problem. Because in order to have a successful business, in order to even get stuff done in your life, you've you've got to start and complete stuff. And again, you're not bad if you don't, but this is about figuring out like how do we understand what's going on? Like can we understand what's going on, which is what we're doing now? And then how can we shift out of this so that we are able to be more productive without the struggle? Not that productivity is the end all be all. That's not what I think your only worth is here on this planet, though surely capitalism might give you that impression, that and the patriarchy. But in all honesty, the more efficient you can be when you're productive, then you have more time for fun stuff like rest and playing and spending time with loved ones and going to the Harry Potter orchestra, like whatever it is you do, right? So it's important that we get to the bottom of this. So let's talk about how we can break free. And I'm going to go over a few different strategies today. I'm sure there's others. This list isn't exhaustive. But the first one I want to talk about is one I've heard elsewhere. I've actually heard it as the 70% rule before, but I've also heard it as the 80% rule. And it's this that you just aim for 80% perfect or 70% perfect. You aim for good enough. Because the thing is good enough or slightly less than perfect, like 80% perfect, is better than not done. Because if you aim for 100% perfect, that's not even possible. So you'll never finish. You'll never put the stuff out there. And in all honesty, if you're an entrepreneur and you're trying to build a business, half the time you don't even know what's going to work. So you just got to start tossing shit out there. I mean, not total crap. But you have to get stuff out there at a faster pace so you can test what's effective, right? If it takes you 3 weeks to film a podcast or a month and a half to do a YouTube video, then it's going to take you years and years to test, but you won't even have good data because things change so quickly. So it's important that you find that balance between quickly producing things, being efficient, but also having things look good enough, right? You don't want to make things totally crappy, which we're going to talk about in a little bit, but the perfectionism piece is not helping you here. So another thing you can do, and this one is a little bit tricking your brain, so maybe have parts of your brain not listen right now, but it's the 5-minute quick start. So you can just say, you know what? I'm going to commit to 5 minutes. I'm going to set a timer and all I have to do is 5 minutes. And you start. And the cool thing is once you start, you actually just keep going because you realize that whatever hump it was, whatever hurdle it was, you felt like you needed to jump to start was actually non-existent. So that 5-minute start can really, really be an effective way to get yourself going. You can also, and this one doesn't work for everyone, but you can do time boxing. So people talk about time blocking, same thing. You can block off a period of time that you're going to work on this with a deadline about how much you're going to get done. It's kind of like a mixture between time blocking and the Pomodoro method, where you're setting a timer, working for a set period of time, and then having a set period of rest. Usually it's supposed to be like 25 minutes of work, 5 minutes of rest. But I find with ADHD, it's actually for a lot of us, if we're in a hyper focus, if we stop after 25 minutes, getting started is so hard, it can be too soon. So I find I can work for like, hmm, I'd say like anywhere from an hour to an hour and a half and not feel like burned out from it so that I have to just shut down. But I can work about that long, take a break, and then do another hour and a half. Sometimes it's only an hour. So what you can do is start to pay attention to what you need. But what I recommend doing is looking at your calendar for the day and just figuring out when you're going to do that in your day to start working this task and then do the 5 minute start. Okay, I'm just going to do this 5 minutes and then see where it goes because chances are it'll go more than 5 minutes. You never know. It might only be 5 minutes and then that would have to be fine. So there's that. Another piece is external accountability. And I talk about a piece of this in my program Ascend, the ADHD Women's Mastery Program, where we actually work on the four main types of how we respond to internal and external expectations. This comes directly from Gretchen Rubin's work. And about 40% of the population, according to Gretchen's research, are people that require external accountability to feel motivated to do anything. So external accountability is really, 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 really important. And it's particularly important with ADHD because of all the struggles that we have with our executive function. We struggle to start things that aren't interesting. And so one way that we can make it interesting is doing like body doubling or co-working. I like going into coffee shops and doing work. Sometimes I vary the coffee shop. You might even do things like a public commitment. I'll tell you what, I just had some new members join my program Ascend, and one of them is really excited about getting on YouTube, something I'm getting into more and wanted to teach eventually, but she's wanting to start now. And I found some really effective strategies to get started that really, really helped me triple my followers, which it was small to begin with, but triple my followers in about a month and a half. And so there's ways that you can do this that I really wanted to teach. But I was like, okay, that's on my to-do list for later. I got all this other stuff. Entered this person in my program. I'm like, that lit a fire under my ass. So I was like, okay, we're doing this now because that was a public commitment. I told her that I would be willing to create something to help her with that. So it's really been nice having that public commitment because I'm like, all right, here we go. We got to get this shit done. And so that helps too. And definitely I notice my perfectionistic tendencies from my past coming up and I'm like, no, we can't mess with that right now. We have to go with good enough. And that brings me to another piece that we're going to talk about later, which is what people's experiences of you when you do good enough. We're going to talk about that later. But last but not least, I want to talk about setting kind of a different kind of deadline. You could consider it a reverse deadline. So look at your deadline, figure out how long it's going to take you to do this, but then back it up. Give yourself some extra time at the end. You might be like, oh my gosh, I could never do that. I get it. I get it. But it's one to experiment with because then you can leave space for the end for if you weren't able to work on one of the days you needed, or if you really feel like refining things, not perfecting, but refining a little bit, you'll have that time versus being really stressed right at the last minute. All right. So those are some strategies to help you break free of this perfectionism procrastination cycle. And if I were you, I would write down in your task list or planner or whatever you do which one you're going to try this week. Because otherwise you're just listening to the podcast and you're thinking, but I really want you to be able to take action. Action is really what's going to help you change your life. And that's why I'm here. So figure out which one of those. Was it the 80% rule, the 5 minute start? Was it the time blocking, time boxing that you can do in combination with the Pomodoro method modified for ADHD? Maybe it's the external accountability like body doubling, co-working, or public commitment. Or maybe shifting your deadline to be a different deadline so you have extra time before you actually have to officially hand something in or post it or whatever. So feel free to share in the comments of the podcast which one you want to do. I would love to see what everyone's trying. It'd be awesome. So I want to get into 2 mindset shifts that need to happen that you may already be catching on to in order for you to get out of this loop more permanently. One is understanding that messy progress is better than perfect stagnation every time. Think about that. Messy progress, better than perfect stagnation. Why is that? Well, if you never put anything out there, you nothing's going to change, right? And you won't be able to test things in your business. So it's better to make some progress, put things out there, test things, than to do nothing. That's mindset shift number 1. And one way to think about that is 70%. This is how one of my former people I was in their program would say it is 70% perfect is perfect. 100% perfect is failure, because when you go for 100% perfect, you're not putting it out there, right? The other mindset shift that you can work on is this. Here's the truth. No one cares. No one cares about your work being perfect. No one cares about your hair. No one cares about your makeup or your outfit, or that maybe you're a little weird. No one cares that you bumble over your words occasionally. I have an editor, but they don't catch everything. And it's like, whatever, that's how I talk. Like, it's true, right? No one cares. The only thing people really care about is that what you offer helps them in some way, without it being ridiculously painful for them to take the information, right? Like, if it's terrible quality, that's going to be really hard for them to be able to get value out of it. But if it's good enough, then that is better, because no one cares. People don't even probably notice. And if they do, why do you care? You don't even know these people. And if they're going to judge you for something, like your hair or your makeup or how you said something. Yeah, if you're saying something like racist or homophobic, that's a different story. I'm not talking about that. But if they're going to judge you for bumbling over your words occasionally, or I don't know, whatever it is, maybe they're not your people, because you value being human. Because I gotta believe in your business, you have moments of imperfection. Hell, everyone knows I do. I just switched platforms from one platform to another one as I had 2 new members coming in. And so it's like, oh, I missed that, because it's all these little tiny admin things and learning a new system. So it's just like, oh my gosh. But when we embrace imperfection, when we embrace good enough, and I'm not saying good enough like mediocre and total shit, but I'm just saying I suspect your good enough is probably better than most people's perfect, to be honest, if you're listening to this. So if you can think about that, most people don't care. Yeah, we don't want to make them work too hard to get the value that we're offering. But when you focus on all those little things, like, oh, I have to have the right background. Yeah, I used to set up like a nice background with a screen I have and all that, like a physical screen I have. And you know what? I got tired of doing it. And you know what? No one cares. No one cares. And so just think about that as you're getting going. Getting things out there is the most important thing. No one also cares. I don't know about you, but when I fold my clothes, I Marie Kondo them. They're not perfect. But guess what? I live alone, so no one cares. And I have clothes that are all pretty, like, naturally gonna not hold wrinkles. But if someone was like, oh, her shirt's a little wrinkled, I don't think I can work with her, they're not gonna wanna work with me anyway. Because that is not a detail I can give a shit about. It's just not. I just, like, do not have the bandwidth to care about if my shirt has a wrinkle or not. That's like, you know what? If you want that, go see an accountant. I'm sorry, I'm not going to rip on accountants. I love accountants. I used to be an accounting major, but we always had all those crisp shirts without wrinkles. But I'm going to tell you what, the amount of stress it was for me to keep it that way was just put me over the edge. So start to shift your mindset and realize that really no one cares. All right. So I hope this episode was as useful for you as it was fun for me. If you're not following this podcast yet, I would love it if you hit that follow or subscribe button wherever you're watching it. I would love it too if you would leave a review. Subscribing, following, leaving a review are all things that when you do that, the algorithms in whatever platform you're getting in this on are like, "Oh, yeah, people like this," and they show it to more people, which, yes, that's good for me, I'm not gonna lie, I get something out of it. But also, it helps other ADHDers benefit from the same stuff you're benefiting from. So let's help each other. I would love it if you would share, follow, or subscribe, comment, review, whatever it is you wanna do. Don't stress yourself out, don't go for perfection. Pick one of those things and I'd be forever grateful. All right, I'll see y'all next time. Take care.